June 17, 1775, Charlestown Peninsula, Massachusetts. The red hills of New England tremble under artillery fire. Smoke rolls upward from burning farmhouses, drifting over a brown earthen fort crowned with a few dozen ragged men. They are farmers mostly, blacksmiths, tradesmen, volunteers with soot-streaked faces and mismatched coats. Above them flaps a scrap of cloth that dares to claim a flag. Down the slope, the professional machine of the British Empire moves in perfect rhythm. Drums beat. Lines of scarlet advance like a tide of fire. Officers bark orders beneath polished tricorn hats, certain the defense will collapse at the first volley. But when their ranks close to range, the farmers do not break. Their command is calm, whispered. Don't fire till you see the whites of their eyes. Then the hill explodes in flame. In minutes, hundreds of redcoats fall. Muskets overheat. Cannon smoke hides the dead, and disbelief flashes through the British line. Retreat is ordered, then a second, then a third assault. By nightfall, the Empire holds the hill but gains nothing except bodies. A British lieutenant writes home that evening, astonished. These were no longer mere peasants. They fought as soldiers. On that day, the world glimpsed the birth of a new kind of army, an army of revolution. When the first shots cracked through dawn mist at Lexington and Concord in April 1775, Britain's empire stood unmatched. The Royal Navy commanded every ocean. Its armies had just defeated France in the 7 Years' War. To London, the 13 colonies were prosperous appendages of victory, loyal, lucrative, and dependent. No serious statesman imagined that a chain of small ports and farms stretching from New Hampshire to Georgia could challenge the structure of imperial power. For a decade, the royal government had been tightening control. War debts demanded revenue. Parliament looked across the Atlantic for repayment. Sugar Acts, Stamp Acts, Townshend duties, each levy born from arithmetic, not understanding. When the colonists petitioned, the reply was silence. When they protested, the answer arrived in red cloth and bayonet steel. To Britain's ruling class, the unrest was a nuisance, not an insurrection. Prime Minister Lord North believed a few thousand regulars could end the disturbances. Seasoned officers carried the same assumption. One display of discipline would scatter any mob of rifle-bearing farmers. Those farmers thought otherwise. Across New England, communities had spent generations organizing local militia, citizen soldiers bound more by neighborhood than hierarchy. They were not professional troops, but they were marksmen who knew their terrain, and they carried memories. The Puritan independence that had built towns beyond royal reach and a fierce attachment to property and self-government. When British patrols marched into Massachusetts to seize gunpowder stores, they stumbled into a chain reaction of ideology and instinct. The initial confrontations left both sides stunned. British regulars fought through ambushes hidden behind stone walls and orchards. On the march back to Boston, 13 miles long, they were harried by farmers firing from every corner of the countryside. By day's end, nearly 300 redcoats were killed or wounded. What London dismissed as riots had erupted into organized pursuit. The Empire's generals responded with predictability, more precision, more regiments, more artillery. Reinforcements from Ireland and Canada swelled the army in Boston to 10,000 men. Among them were veterans of Wolfe's campaigns in Quebec, soldiers drilled in European codes of line and volley. Facing them beyond the harbor was an improvised force of twice their number, armed with hunting muskets and conviction. The balance looked absurd, yet the longer the standoff lasted, the clearer the miscalculation became. Each week added competence to courage. Blacksmiths turned plows into bayonets. Young officers learned the geometry of defense by building earthworks on Charlestown Heights. For the first time, colonial men from 13 provinces stood under a single direction, answering now not to their governors but to the Continental Congress meeting in Philadelphia. Into this fragile experiment walked a tall Virginian with powdered hair and a soldier's bearing. George Washington, veteran of Britain's earlier wars, accepted command of what was grandly named the Continental Army. The title concealed more chaos than organization. No uniforms, scarce powder, scattered allegiances. But Washington carried the one essential ingredient the rebellion required: coherence. He saw before most did that outrage without structure would wither. In letters to Congress, he wrote bluntly, "Discipline is the soul of an army." To men who still thought of themselves as free citizens first, he imposed rank, schedules, and accountability. Mistakes were many, but momentum favored belief. By the time rumors of the battle at Bunker Hill reached southern colonies, the myth of British invincibility had already cracked. For the officers watching from Boston's barricades, the transformation was incomprehensible. They had been trained to see war as ritual, a choreography of marching lines, drums, cadence, and courage in prescribed order. What confronted them now was chaos wrapped in conviction, volleys fired from fog, militias striking supply columns, an enemy unwilling to collapse after casualties that would break any regular army. The British Empire had measured rebellion by rules learned on European fields. In America, it meant something else: warfare powered by imagination and grievance. And just weeks later, as smoke rose from the hills of Charlestown, the proof of that collision would turn disbelief into astonishment. When the smoke cleared over Bunker Hill, the numbers told only half the story. The British had captured the ground, but at a cost that reverberated through every regiment in Boston. Over 1,000 casualties, nearly half their attacking force. The red lines of discipline had climbed that hill 3 times, and each time farmers had cut them down with deliberate volleys. For the first time in centuries, the world's most professional army had bled under the hands of amateurs. Across the Atlantic, the reports were incomprehensible. Parliament called it murderous obstinacy. Newspapers described Americans as stiff-necked rustics. In the drawing rooms of London, the idea that a collection of merchants and plowmen could stand against the Empire's prestige seemed absurd. But in the diaries of the men who had survived Charlestown, disbelief gave way to grudging awe. One lieutenant wrote, "They loaded with an accuracy few of our own can match." For the colonists, that accuracy became faith. The hastily organized siege of Boston hardened into a national cause. 13 colonies, once 13 rivals, sent supplies, muskets, and men toward the new army forming outside Cambridge. Beneath tents sewn from sailcloth, they drilled to a rhythm America had never heard before, the relentless cadence of independence taking shape. George Washington arrived that July to assume command. He found thousands of volunteers, few officers, little powder, and less patience. His first act was to impose uniformity. Inspections at dawn, punishments for drunkenness, and hierarchy where none existed. Those who despised discipline called him tyrant. Within months, they called him leader. The Continental Army's transformation was less visible than inspiring. Soldiers learned parade ground maneuvers beside cornfields. Carts of food from New England towns replaced London provisioning chains. Artillerymen melted church bells into cannon metal. When Henry Knox hauled heavy guns from Fort Ticonderoga through snowdrifts 400 miles long to Boston, Washington knew the rebellion had found both industry and endurance. In March 1776, that endurance paid off. British commanders awoke to cannon barrels staring down from the heights of Dorchester. Within days, the Royal Navy sailed out of Boston Harbor, abandoning the city it had sworn to hold. The Army regroups to the north, shocked into the realization that containing rebellion might require annihilating it. Their empire moved accordingly. General William Howe prepared to reconquer the colonies from New York, assembling the largest expeditionary force Britain had ever launched. Over 30,000 soldiers, including German Hessian mercenaries hired to bolster numbers. When the red sails filled the Hudson in July 1776, the spectacle dwarfed anything America had seen. To British eyes, the campaign was renewal, the empire reasserting order. Yet the timing betrayed them. On the same week Howe's fleet appeared, Congress in Philadelphia adopted the Declaration of Independence. For the rebels drilling on Long Island, the parchment read aloud at parade lines was more than rhetoric. It was instruction. They were no longer British subjects defending grievances. They were citizens defending creation itself. Still, ideals did not guarantee victory. That summer brought humiliating defeats. New York fell to the invaders. Washington's army barely escaped over the Hudson's fog. Across New Jersey, villages burned as British columns advanced. To many Europeans, the rebellion seemed finished. Its resurrection came with winter. On Christmas night 1776, Washington crossed the ice-choked Delaware River and struck Trenton in a blizzard, capturing hundreds of Hessians while losing not a single man in combat. Days later, a second strike at Princeton drove British detachments from the field. The irregulars of the previous year now moved with precision. not guerrillas but trained troops executing coordinated attacks. One astonished British officer admitted, "These rebels maneuver like veterans." From that moment, Britain faced an enemy it could neither understand nor suppress. The men in faded homespun coats had forged coherence out of chaos. By 1777, they marched under banners stitched with Latin mottos. Guided by officers whose minds had been tempered by both failure and endurance, the empire's arrogance had met an unlikely alchemy. Farmers turned revolutionaries. And within a single year, what began as defiance would harden into a conflict that redrew the world itself. The question was no longer whether rebellion could be punished, but whether it could be stopped at all. The answers, and the reverberations on both sides of the ocean, would unfold in the people who carried the rebellion from survival to strategy, from the brush fields of New Jersey to the alliance halls of Europe. The Continental Army began as a mirror of its nation, diverse, disorganized, determined. There were blacksmiths from Pennsylvania, fishermen from Massachusetts, farmers from Virginia, and apprentices barely out of school. Few had uniforms and fewer had shoes. Their weapons ranged from hunting muskets to inherited flintlocks older than their owners. What united them was something Britain had never needed to cultivate: necessity. When British columns marched with drums and banners, these men fought from stone walls and forest shadows. They were not defying honor, though they were redefining it. Each battle was a classroom. At first, volleys came too early, formations broke too quickly, and soldiers scattered under cannon fire. But every retreat carried a lesson. By the winter of 1776, veterans who had survived Princeton and Trenton drilled with the precision of professionals. They learned that endurance could humiliate expertise. A letter from Private Joseph Plum Martin describes that metamorphosis with raw clarity. We had become soldiers without uniforms, hardened to hunger and to fear. Victory was not measured in miles gained but in the will to return after loss. Those same men, once treated as rebels, began to view themselves as citizens in uniform, a distinction that changed the very meaning of soldiering. For Britain's hired mercenaries, the war was wage and duty. For Americans, it became identity. British officers, confident in European doctrine, structured warfare around formation, lines, drills, volleys, an elegant geometry of destruction. But geometry dies in wilderness. From the skirmish at Concord Bridge to the ambushes along New Jersey roads, the Continental militias exploited every hedge, tree, and river bend. Washington realized early that survival mattered more than spectacle. He instructed his generals, "Seek battles only when the ground favors liberty, not pride." This subtle inversion, fight anywhere but on the enemy's terms, made the redcoats chase ghosts across thousands of miles. Ambush became strategy. Evasion became art. Yet the revolution was not won by irregularity alone. At Monmouth in 1778, under the drilling of a Prussian veteran, Baron von Steuben, American troops fought in open field without breaking. Their musket lines reinstated order under punishing heat, forcing British withdrawal. Witnesses recorded astonishment. The colonists stand firm as British grenadiers. War had turned into dialogue, Europe's classical warfare speaking across smoke to America's improvisation. Each side learned from the other, but one learned faster. George Washington never commanded the most troops nor wielded the most revolutionary ideas. His strength was different: constancy, an unshowy, relentless endurance. In a world of gentlemen officers obsessed with glory, he embodied patience as a tactic. After early defeats around New York, lesser commanders might have resigned. Washington did not. He refused to expose the army to obliteration, choosing preservation over theater. His correspondence reveals a man measuring every decision against the length of the war, not the width of a battlefield. His genius lay in restraint. When desperate congressmen demanded symbolic victories, he focused on survival. When angry recruits mutinied over pay, he reminded them that honor could outlast coin. In January 1778, as his soldiers froze at Valley Forge, Washington walked the camp lines daily. He spoke little, saluted every sentinel, and ensured that in the empire of despair, discipline still ruled. To the British, this refusal to vanish became incomprehensible. Major Charles Stedman of the Royal Army wrote, His army was lost in numbers, yet his presence made it infinite. Washington transformed defeat into endurance, endurance into legitimacy. When France sought proof that supporting the revolution was not folly, they looked less at congressional debates than at this Virginian who could hold a ruined army together through sheer gravity of character. The rebellion changed its participants long before it changed maps. A Massachusetts farmer who fired a musket in 1775 did not begin as an American. The word barely existed beyond pamphlets. Each encounter with British regulars made him one. Britain's practices of occupation, burning towns suspected of sedition, seizing crops to feed troops, crystallized opposition into identity. Outrage wrote the first national stories. In taverns, families repeated news from distant fronts, Ticonderoga, Trenton, Saratoga. Each name became myth, binding provinces hundreds of miles apart through common rumor and pride. The king's proclamation labeling them open and avowed enemies unintentionally made them exactly that. A people united by being condemned together. Inside Britain's own ranks, morale withered as purpose blurred. Officers who once carried themselves as tutors of civilization found themselves policing hostile villages where every door hid a musket. Letters home spoke less of victory than fatigue. A corporal stationed near Philadelphia confessed, "We take the towns by day and they take them by night. It is a labor without end." In this climate, perception became power. The British viewed America as geography to be reconquered. Americans viewed it as destiny to be defended. That difference turned the war from colonial rebellion into revolution. By 1777, both sides stood changed. The British had learned caution. The Americans had learned confidence. Between them stretched the world's first modern civil conflict. A fight between empire and idea, soldiers and citizens, obedience and imagination. The next part of this story would test every lesson learned so far. On the battlefields of Saratoga and later Yorktown, when the incredulous eyes of Britain's finest witnessed their former subjects outfight, outthink and ultimately outlast them. In 1775, the Continental forces were a memory without a body. No arsenals, no factories, no navy. Their muskets were inherited relics, their powder imported or improvised, their uniforms an accident of whatever cloth could be found. The British expected scarcity to strangle rebellion faster than rifles ever could. Instead, the colonies turned scarcity into invention. Blacksmiths forged bayonets from broken scythes. Church bells became cannon through makeshift foundries. Tailors cut brown coats because blue dye was exhausted, unknowingly creating the earliest American uniform. Administration followed improvisation. The Continental Congress, huddled in candlelit halls, learned to legislate war, appointing quartermasters, minting paper currency, standardizing muskets by borrowing French templates. The transformation was not immediate. Chaos never vanished. But by 1777, supply depots lined the Hudson, wagon trains resembled European logistics, and a chain of command stretched from Philadelphia to the frontier. Weaponry, too, reflected adaptation. Flintlocks remained crude, yet colonial gunsmiths perfected the long-range rifle, a weapon slower to reload but far deadlier in experienced hands. At ranges beyond 100 yards, red-coated formations became targets in open meadow. British officers called rifles ungentlemanly. Washington called them useful. The army that rose from disorder depended as much on carpenters and seamstresses as on soldiers. Its technology was human endurance. From the journals of British soldiers emerges another narrative. Confusion giving way to reluctant respect. Captain Frederick Mackenzie of the 23rd Regiment had arrived certain that rebellion would dissolve before demonstration. His first report from Boston complained not of cowardice but of marksmanship. Their peasants aim like gamekeepers, and without fear. 2 years later, after marching across the Jerseys behind General Howe, he wrote again, "This war cannot be concluded upon our chosen terms. The enemy fights not for land but for belief." Such testimonies multiplied as campaigns dragged on. Veterans who had fought in Europe recognized familiar tactics only to see them eroded by the terrain and an enemy's will to improvise. Behind every victory column, supply lines bled away under guerrilla attack. The redcoats that once signified strength became liabilities, bright targets in forests of green and gray. Even officers hardened to colonial resistance began to question London's expectations. "We are told they are farmers," one major lamented after Princeton. "Yet each man behaves as if an army rests upon him alone." Respect was reluctant but real. When prisoners were exchanged after Saratoga, British troops tipped their hats to the ragged men filing past. Discipline met its mirror image in endurance. By 1780, exhaustion was a universal language. Every rebellion needs witnesses. France, nursing humiliation from its loss to Britain a decade earlier, watched closely. Reports of colonists defeating royal regiments ignited both revenge and curiosity. Could these provincial insurgents weaken Europe's mightiest trade rival? When Benjamin Franklin arrived in Paris, the old man in simple homespun cloth idolized by salons, the rebellion gained a diplomat more potent than any general. His charm drew intellectuals. His practicality secured muskets. Throughout 1777-1778, French ports loaded ships with powder, uniforms, and experienced officers. The turning point came after Saratoga in October 1777. The surrender of General Burgoyne's army convinced Versailles that the revolution was viable. Within months, France recognized the United States as a nation and declared war on Britain. The global board tilted instantly. Fleets clashed in the Caribbean. British captains guarded India instead of New England. To the continental soldiers, half-starved near Valley Forge, French aid translated into bread, muskets, and hope. To British soldiers reading dispatches, France's entry transformed insurrection into world war. The illusion of a limited rebellion shattered. A British corporal summed up the shock plainly. "We sought to punish a riot and awoke at war with the world." Behind muskets marched arguments, pamphlets, sermons, nightly debates by campfires about why they fought. Each regiment carried fragments of Thomas Paine's Common Sense, its sentences recited like scripture. The sun never shined on a cause of greater worth. No European army had ever fought for this kind of abstraction. The redcoats served king and country. The revolutionaries fought for something yet unnamed, a republic conceived in promise, still uncertain in execution. Officers drafted codes of conduct banning plunder, insisting that rebellion should not mirror the empire it resisted. Even amid hardship, they sought moral difference as their most strategic victory. The contradiction was immense. Enslaved men fought for liberty, poor farmers for equality among gentlemen. Many saw the irony, few saw alternatives. But belief, however imperfect, sustained them. In a letter to his wife, John Adams wrote, "We are bound to a cause rather than to a command." That sentiment, multiplying across thousands of tents, gave ordinary volunteers the endurance of ideology. When British soldiers saw such opponents, barefoot, starving yet still advancing, they mistook it for fanatic resolve. It was something stranger. These were people inventing a nation as they fought for it. Every skirmish was a constitutional paragraph, every victory a proof of philosophy. By 1777 and 1778, the conflict had grown beyond rebellion into recreation. Empires had fought for conquest before. This war fought for identity. From the corridors of London to the forests of New York, officers on both sides recognized that neither side could unlearn what it had seen. Britain had witnessed the impossible. Subjects who absorbed the discipline of empire and used it to end that empire's control. The next chapter of this documentary will immerse us in the moment when realization hardened into fact, Saratoga and the campaigns that followed, when the world's most certain army looked across the field and saw its mirror image advance, disciplined, determined, and free. Autumn 1777. The green Hudson Valley curved through fields turning gold, and with it turned the fate of the war. General John Burgoyne, confident and theatrical, marched south from Canada with 7,000 men, intent on cutting rebellious New England away from the other colonies. It was a neat diagram of conquest drawn on London's maps, a pincer closing from north and south to sever rebellion forever. Reality, as it often did in this war, refused ink. Burgoyne's army moved slowly, wagons overloaded with silver-plated, officers' kits, winter coats, and loyalist families trailing behind. Rain turned the roads to clay. Local militias shadowed him like ghosts. felling trees across paths, picking at convoys, vanishing back into forest. What had been an invasion became an attrition. By September, the British reached a ridge near Saratoga, exhausted but still proud. Across the meadow, behind rough barricades, stood the new Continental Army. Not the mob of 1775, but organized regiments commanded by sharp-eyed officers such as Horatio Gates and fiery Benedict Arnold. They wore mismatched coats, but held formation with a discipline that stunned those who confronted them. At Freeman's Farm, Burgoyne's red lines advanced under cannon smoke, expecting collapse. Instead, they met proportioned fire. Volleys measured, reloaded, returned. When Arnold charged with riflemen through the haze, even captured prisoners admitted surprise. These colonials fight like a nation. The battle raged for hours. Musket balls tore cornfields into dust storms. Artillery thunder rolled along the river. A second engagement at Bemis Heights sealed it. American rifles targeted officers first, shattering British command. Wounded. On the field, Arnold forced his horse forward, shouting for one more charge. By evening, Burgoyne's ranks lay fractured. Supply wagons were gone, morale bleeding out through mud and disbelief. Retreat proved impossible. Surrounding forests crawled with local militia, and the Hudson behind him was barred by American pontoons. In desperation, Burgoyne requested an armistice. On October 17, 1777, he surrendered all 5,800 men to the army he had once dismissed as rebels and amateurs. The surrender shocked every European capital. Paris celebrated in candlelit salons, proof that the British giant could stumble. In London, silence filled the corridors of Parliament. A stunned Lord North read dispatches twice. The Empire's invincibility, so long taken for granted, had collapsed in a New York meadow. British officers lamented the optic humiliation. Captain Robert Kingston wrote bitterly, "Who would believe this rabble could unhorse an empire?" Another, more reflective, called it the finest army lost to the finest purpose of men who refused blindness. For the Americans, Saratoga was more than field and victory. It was legitimacy. Soldiers who once doubted their training saw the redcoats stack muskets before them, formal surrender with drums soft as apology. Washington, camped miles away, understood immediately. This was proof that his ragged creation could stand equal to Europe. A great event, he called it, understated as always, and one that may bring favor where passion has failed. It did exactly that. When French diplomats received confirmation of Saratoga, their hesitation ended. What conviction lacked had been replaced by evidence and blood. An alliance was signed early the next year, delivering ships, muskets, engineers, and the professional polish the rebellion still lacked. The revolution had outgrown its birthplace. Now it had allies to match its dream. On the ground, the psychological reversal was complete. Red-clad prisoners trudged down American roads watched by farmers who offered food instead of vengeance. British discipline endured captivity with dignity, but their eyes reflected something new: bewilderment. Years later, a sergeant remembered the disbelief. We had carried the king's color into every quarter of the globe, and here it fell at the feet of peasants. The capital of disbelief was no longer Boston or London. It was inside every soldier who had seen a colonial line hold. Even within the British High Command, a grudging calculus emerged. This was no rebellion to extinguish in months, but a war that could devour generations. Some proposed negotiations, others doubled down on pride. The king himself demanded persistence. Yet under that command, the old confidence was gone, replaced by a quiet dread that they were witnessing, not just revolt, but reinvention. Saratoga had pivoted the war. The colonies might still lose battles, but they would never again lose belief. And across the sea, the empire understood the unthinkable, that the zeal of free men could outweigh the training of monarchs. The war's course would now flow southward, to Philadelphia, to Charleston, to Yorktown, where that realization would harden into surrender. When British soldiers finally marched into those final campaigns, their faces no longer carried derision for the men ahead. They carried respect, edged with fear. They had seen the birth of revolution, and they knew it could kill empires. 4 years separated Saratoga from the war's last act. 4 years of exhaustion, attrition, and persistence that neither side had foreseen. The British still held New York, Charleston, and dozens of coastal garrisons, but the rebellion had become an organism that could not be cut apart. Farmers and fishermen fighting part-time bled the empire full-time. By 1781, the war's weight had shifted south. Hoping to exploit Loyalist support, Britain sent 8,000 troops under Lord Charles Cornwallis into the Carolinas. What began as a campaign of confidence dissolved into nightmare. Swamp ambushes. In South Carolina, skirmishes at Cowpens and Guilford Courthouse. Each battle chipped away at one more illusion of control. Cornwallis still believed he could trap Washington's army in Virginia, encamping near the coastal port of Yorktown. It was a decision born of logic, undone by geography. For months, Washington had pleaded with his French allies for a decisive engagement. Now chance and timing delivered it. From the north, Washington and Rochambeau's combined army of nearly 17,000 men began the march south. From the Atlantic, Admiral de Grasse's fleet sealed the Chesapeake Bay. 30 ships of the line, their masts threading the horizon. No British relief force could enter. No escape route existed. By early October, Yorktown was an island of empire surrounded by artillery. British sentries watched in disbelief as cannon batteries sprouted overnight, 2 miles of siege lines creeping closer each dawn. French engineers taught Americans how to build trenches with the precision of their own masters at Vauban. The students improved the lesson. When the Allied bombardment began, it was apocalyptic. Drums of tar burst, red clouds burned above ammunition depots, the air filled with dirt and splinters of empire. Inside Yorktown, Cornwallis wrote home, "The fire is incessant. We change quarters every hour. No place is safe for 20 minutes." His soldiers, starving and exhausted, defended with the stoicism drilled into them since boyhood. But they could read fate in the sky. On October 14th, a young French viscount and an American colonel led twin night assaults to capture the last defensive redoubts. The American leader was Alexander Hamilton, the West Indian clerk turned artillery officer. His column stormed the ramparts silently until a bayonet charge broke the position before a shot was fired. By dawn, Allied flags fluttered on the captured works. The British line was broken. The horizon now belonged to their former subjects. 2 days later, Cornwallis requested terms. He claimed illness, sending General O'Hara to surrender in his place. When the parley drums rolled on October 19th, the symbolic orchestration of empire closing was perfect. British troops marched out between rows of Americans on one side, French on the other. Their fifes played "The World Turned Upside Down." Their muskets were reversed, a gesture of respect and defeat. At the head of the Continental line stood men who had once been farmers, mechanics, and merchants, now motionless in ranks as polished as any drilled in London. Observers recorded no gloating. There was exhaustion, awe, a sense that history had paused. A French officer wrote, "The charm of monarchy dies before discipline born of liberty." Washington accepted the surrender in silence. His aides noticed a brief flicker of emotion cross his face. Not joy, but relief, almost too heavy to lift. Word of Yorktown rippled outward. When the news reached London, Prime Minister Lord North reportedly gasped, "Oh God, it's all over." For Britain, it meant not only the loss of territory but the unraveling of certainty, proof that empire could be contested by conviction. In America, church bells pealed through the night. Yet even in jubilation, soldiers were stunned by the scale of transformation. They had outfought the empire that had once educated them in war. In the correspondence of captured officers lay poetry none intended. An anonymous British sergeant wrote, "We looked upon their line and saw ourselves, but younger and free." That sentence, preserved among dispatches, became a quiet epitaph for the imperial century that ended there. For the Americans, Yorktown meant survival's graduation into sovereignty. It was not a clean victory. The war dragged formally until 1783. But the Revolution's pulse no longer depended on battle. The empire that taught its colonies discipline had been undone by its own lesson. When autumn light faded over the fields of Virginia that evening, the Chesapeake reflected 2 flags, the old Union Jack lowered by ritual, and the new stars and stripes rising uncertainly and brittle. Windy, what began at Concord as a protest, ended as the prototype of modern revolution, an army of idea, defeating an army of order. The cost in lives was grim, the cost in illusion incalculable. The British soldiers who had mocked the farmers' war returned home veterans of defeat. Across the ocean, those same farmers returned to plows, veterans of creation. The day's calm, broken only by the creaking of stacked muskets, closed the loop begun on Bunker Hill. Farmers no longer in rebellion, but revolutionaries who had remade the world. In the years to come, the consequences of that surrender would echo through England's parliaments and America's new republic alike. A reckoning of empire, identity, and the future shape of freedom. Yorktown's silence carried across oceans faster than any sail. In December 1781, when word of Cornwallis's surrender reached London, Parliament fell into stunned paralysis. The great imperial project that had circled the globe had been humbled by men at once called peasants. No celebratory dispatch followed, only resignation and disbelief. Lord North's government toppled within months. Britain's commanders blamed distance, mismanagement, and France. But private letters revealed the deeper realization. They had not merely lost land, they had lost definition. The empire wasn't defeated by a single battle. It had been eroded by an idea. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, jubilation folded quickly into exhaustion. The Continental Army stood poised between triumph and bankruptcy. Pay was months overdue. Uniforms hung in tatters. Washington, encamped at Newburgh, feared that victory might dissolve into anarchy. He wrote that anarchy, or that anarchy which would succeed war, would be more dangerous than war itself. Yet something resilient had taken root. In taverns and courthouses, men raised toasts to liberty with discipline. They had learned both in equal measure over 8 years of war. Farmers spoke in the rhythms of soldiers. Soldiers looked again toward their fields. The victory's human cost loomed in every colony. Wooden-legged veterans limped through market squares. Widows queued for meager pensions never paid. Late returns counted 25,000, dead on the American side and roughly the same among British regulars and Hessians, a generation spent proving that principle could outlast. Empire reconstruction would test the newborn ideal, more than redcoats ever had. The 13 republics, now free of an external crown, faced the peril of division from within. Washington's address to officers at Newburgh, delivered without rank or ceremony, steadied tempers by reminding them that power surrendered willingly would be the revolution's truest victory. Across Britain, reflection replaced fury. A few politicians called the result providence. Others called it punishment. Edmund Burke declared that moral force has triumphed over material. In the letters of ordinary redcoats, simplicity replaced politics. They fought because they believed. We fought because we were told. The empire turned inward. India, not America, would now be its proving ground. The Royal Navy learned the price of complacency and began the reforms that would later fuel its 19th century reascendancy. But the psychological wound remained. The empire had taught its colonies discipline, literacy, and law, and those very tools had armed rebellion. For France, the victory offered both glory and debt. Their fleets returned battered, their treasury near collapse. Within a decade, their own monarchy would face a revolution inspired partly by the example abroad. What began as Britain's colonial dispute had detonated as a worldwide shift in thought. Back in America, the image of unity was imperfect but intoxicating. Painters immortalized it with deliberate idealism. The surrender at Yorktown reframed as order and ceremony rather than mud and exhaustion. Those canvases, shipped to Europe later, helped craft the legend of the People's Army. But for the men who had been there, legend was unnecessary. Letters from veterans tell of simple awakenings, seeing Atlantic sunsets without fear of patrols, watching children grow beneath peace that had cost them youth. In one soldier's diary, a final line reads, "We have earned the right to try again." He meant the experiment of self-rule itself. When Washington marched his remaining troops home in 1783, he ordered no parades. Only silence along the road, muskets reversed as they crossed the line between war and peace. One observer noted, "They looked not like victors but founders." In that phrase lay the essence of aftermath, a realization that victory was never just over Britain, but over habit. The colonies that once measured themselves by the empire's shadow now had to invent their own light, and as Britain licked its wounds, the Royal Army carried home a grudging respect. Soldiers who had survived Saratoga or Yorktown told tavern audiences in Portsmouth and London about farmers who had stood their ground, muskets steady, eyes unshaken. Defeat, they admitted, had looked strangely like dignity. The atmosphere of humility and reassessment on both sides marked the start of a new conversation that would, within a generation, transform foes into trading partners and enemies into allies. That fragile reconciliation, the building of coexistence from astonishment, would define the next chapter of history. In the first years of peace, America and Britain stared across the same ocean from utterly changed shores. The Atlantic that had carried commands and gunpowder now carried silent ships loaded with merchants, diplomats, and possibility. The Treaty of Paris, signed in 1783, formalized what had already been decided on distant fields. Britain acknowledged the independence of the United States, but embedded within the clauses of trade and territory was an unfamiliar respect. In the negotiations, British envoy David Hartley confessed privately, "They have defeated us in the field yet maintained the manners of Englishmen." It was a paradox neither side could fully decipher, how rebellion and civility had coexisted. In London, debate about the loss gave way to introspection. The old contempt for provincials faded into analysis. Military historians catalogued every misjudgment, logistics stretched across oceans, arrogance of command, and failure to understand that conviction can outfight discipline. Reform followed, promotion based on merit rather than birth, new emphasis on mobility and colonial diplomacy. The empire that emerged in the 19th century bore scars from America's lesson. In America, victory did not end hunger or politics. Inflation soared. Veterans sold patriots for pennies. The Confederation Congress wobbled between principles and paralysis. Yet within the disunity, a new texture of identity grew, citizens accustomed to choosing rather than obeying. Pamphlets, once weapons of propaganda, evolved into arguments for governance. Out of weary camps and emptied treasuries, a constitution would eventually rise. That generation carried the British defeat like a birthmark. In taverns where independence had been whispered, people now spoke of world recognition. Shipyards in Boston repaired, captured British frigates now recommissioned under an American flag. Children played with wooden soldiers painted not red but blue. Myths began their long parade. Washington refusing a crown, the Minuteman waiting alert among morning reeds, the flag uniting 13 stars. Reality was rougher, but nations are built as much by memory as by fact. Across the Atlantic, reconciliation moved quicker than resentment. Commercial interests bound the two nations long before diplomacy did. By the 1790s, British merchants, pragmatic above all, were again supplying American ports with goods the infant republic could not yet manufacture. Cloth from Manchester, iron from Wales. American grain and timber returned as payment. Trade succeeded where pride could not. Culturally, too, the severed link refused separation. The English language, once the medium of order shouted across battlefields, became the shared bridge of literature and law. Former soldiers on both sides began writing memoirs, less about victory or shame than bewildered admiration. Lieutenant Thomas Anbury's letters home remarked, "They fought us with our own spirit, and it is impossible not to respect them." Out of that respect evolved one of history's rarest outcomes, a civil war that ended in potential friendship. Decades later, when Britain burned Washington in the War of 1812, it was more rematch than reprisal. Yet even that conflict ended with negotiation rather than conquest. Memory of shared roots refused extinction. For Europe, the Revolution's aftermath shook foundations far beyond London. Kings and ministers studied America's victory as biological scientists study contagion. If farmers could unseat the world's most powerful empire, what might peasants do elsewhere? Within 10 years, France exploded. Within 50, the vocabulary of revolt had become European grammar. The phrase, "we hold these truths," traveled faster than any musket ball. Back in the new United States, survivors aged quietly. They farmed, taught, printed newspapers, built bridges, each act of construction a rebuttal to the prediction that democracy would collapse into chaos. The army that had won independence shrank deliberately. Washington resigned his commission before applause could sculpt him into a monarch. Even George III, when told of this, reportedly said, "If he does that, he will be the greatest man in the world." For the redcoats who had seen farmers become revolutionaries, the memory softened with age. Some emigrated to the young republic they once fought. Others corresponded with their former adversaries. In veterans' letters on both sides appeared the same perplexing sentiment: pride without hatred. By century's end, Britain had accepted loss as transformation, not humiliation. America, for all its conflicts and contradictions, had done what no colony before dared: turn rebellion into a functioning idea. The two would face each other again in trade and war, in cooperation, but never again as master and servant. It was the quiet reconciliation of shared inheritance, common tongue, common law, and a mutual belief that liberty, once declared, can never be entirely recalled. The reflection that follows belongs not to governments but to time itself. The understanding that the day Britain saw its colonies turn farmers into revolutionaries was, in truth, the day both nations began becoming themselves. When muskets finally fell silent and the smoke drifted from the fields of Virginia, neither side entirely understood what had happened. The British Empire, still vast and powerful, had not collapsed. It had simply encountered an idea it could not subdue. The men who had once been its subjects had learned painfully and visibly to command themselves. The transformation had not been born of vengeance, nor entirely of politics. It happened in the long patience of discipline. A farmer holding a musket at Lexington, a ferryman guiding Washington's troops across a frozen river, an officer declining a crown he could easily have claimed. Each choice, however small, whispered the same phrase in 100 accents: "We will be our own masters." For Britain, the loss was also deliverance. Out of defeat came humility, reform, and a reimagined empire that learned to govern with balance rather than assumption. For America, victory was never final. It was an open question carried into every generation that followed. What shall we do with the liberty we have taken? Centuries later, the old battlefields lie quiet. Grass sways where regiments once stood in rigid ranks. At dawn on those hills, the wind brushes stone memorials and carries faint echoes. Drums, commands, a single voice reading a declaration to an uncertain world. In that sound, Britain and America still share something profound: the proof that nations, like people, are shaped not only by their triumphs but by what they decide to learn from loss. The redcoats who looked across those lines in disbelief saw more than defiance. They saw the beginning of a new political species, ordinary men willing to wager everything on conviction. Their astonishment was history's turning point. And so the story ends where it began, not with crowns or cannons, but with citizens. The same farmers who once bowed to empire had stood, fired, endured, and then astonishingly built. From their fields, the modern world took root. In that moment, on that soil, the empire's finest soldiers saw something greater than rebellion. They saw the future, men and women claiming the right to decide it for themselves.